Welcome back to Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast, or LYOR. That's right, I thought there weren't enough confusing acronyms in the world of board game broadcasting, so I decided to make a podcast that's got another one. And yes, you heard that correctly, this is a podcast about board games. We talk about board game experiences, playing board games, we review board games, but we don't go over any of those messy rules that you never want to hear about. Today we're going to be following our normal format. We're going to talk about some games I've played recently. Then we're going to move on to our feature game of the day, which today is Call to Adventure, the Stormlight Archive Edition. Just as a quick reminder, because we don't talk about the rules here on Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast, I'm going to be placing links in the description of this podcast that teach the games I'm going to be talking about today. If you're interested in one of the games I talk about today, and if you'd like some more context and like to know more about how the game is played, please feel free to check out one of those links to get a better feel of what the rules for the game are. So the first game we're going to talk about today is Dominant Species. This is a game that was designed by the late Chad Jensen, and it's published by GMT Games. Now this is the only GMT game that I own, but as somebody that grew up playing war games, I'd be interested in others. I just don't know if I necessarily have the right group to play them right now. My wife isn't that interested. Other members of my group are well receptive to different kinds of games, but I almost feel like people who play GMT games are almost a different breed. You look at games like the coin games, and then really most of the GMT catalog. If you really like kind of drab color schemes, relatively boring cover art, the GMT games are the games for you. Now, of course, the cover art is not indicative of the experience found within a game, but it can make it hard to pull out a game and get other people excited to play them. Fortunately, this is not the case for Dominant Species. Dominant Species has a vibrant, exciting cover, and once you explain what the object of the game is, most people seem like they're pretty interested to play it. It helps also that the game is incredible. I love Dominant Species, and I'd forgotten actually how much I loved it. It's been a while since I got to play it. It is simple, it is elegant, and yet it is incredibly deep. There's so much to keep in mind, there's so much to plan for, and there's so many little things you can do to change your luck. To change your standing on the board. This isn't a luck game. There's very little luck involved, maybe a little bit with which domination cards come up, but this is otherwise, or for the most part, a completely no luck game. This is actually probably one of the heaviest games in my collection if you go by the Board Game Geek weight system. But when I say that the game is simple and elegant, I really mean that. What's amazing about this game is there's a lot of decision making and a lot of thinking and a lot of strategic and also, to an extent, tactical play. But the game is really very straightforward and very simple to understand. And I think you could get through the rules explanation for a new player in 15 to 20 minutes easy. You set up, you explain a couple things like how domination works and how food works, then you go through the actions you can take on the action control track, and that's pretty much it. And the nice thing about those action spaces is that for the most part, especially once you start playing, they're really quite intuitive. You can easily start picking up on the flow of how a turn works. You can get a feel for what actions on the map are going to be happening before other actions. And it only takes maybe a round and a half for people who are new to the game to start really jiving with the system and the mechanics that it employs. And it helps that the player aids are fantastic. And the rule book is also fantastic. But I'm pretty sure this is widely regarded as one of the best rule books in the board game industry. It's concise. It lays everything out in a very clear manner. Looking rules up is pretty easy, which is usually a detriment for most rule books. But I want to return to those player aids because those player aids are wonderful. You almost can just start playing the game with just the player aids. Once you've explained how each action works on that action track, as long as you make sure everyone at the table knows that almost any questions they have are going to be answered by just checking their playmat, it's remarkable how easily you can get people into this game and playing really, really quickly. The only downside to this game is that it unfortunately plays best at 6 players, which for whatever reason just seems to be a number that's impossible to attain, especially nowadays when we're trying to do social distancing and things like that. I've heard you can play this game at 3 players where each player plays 2 different species and then their lower score is their end game score. I haven't tried that yet, so I can't comment on it. But it's something I definitely want to look into now because this is a game that once I play it, I'm just constantly thinking about it afterward in a good way. And I'm thinking about the way the game flows. There's a wonderful narrative over the course of the game. Species rise and they fall as the cube economy, I guess you could call it, balances itself out. As you place glacier tiles to knock out areas that score a lot of points for your opponents, There are so many options and so many things that can happen in this game, and so many different paths you can take to trying to eke out more points than your opponents, that I just find it absolutely wonderful, and I wish I could play it more often. It is that good. And it might be a game that I actually review as a future game here in the future. We'll see if that happens. But in the meantime, if you don't mind heavier games with a lot of decision making and plenty of fun cutthroat action, this is a game that's very cutthroat. You're absolutely trying to destroy all the other species of animals on the planet and make sure that yours is the dominant of those species. This game is just excellent, and I could recommend it to anyone that's into medium to heavy games that have a lot of player interaction. This is a game for you. I highly recommend it. And this was Dominant Species by Chad Jensen. I also got a chance to play Lords of Hellas. This is designed by Adam Kwapinski, and it is published by Awaken Realms. So, something you should know about me, I'm a big fan of Greek mythology. I studied classics for a time when I was at college. I'm also a relatively big fan of sci-fi, so naturally this is a wonderful marriage between the two. It is a dudes on a map game, area control game, that takes place in an alternate history where the Greek gods were aliens that distributed their technology around Greece and then just kind of left. And you are there to pick up the pieces and try to eke out your own section of the land. You're trying to prove your valor. You're trying to make sure your faction is the best. Now, I like Lords of Hellas. I like it quite a bit, I think. It's got a really interesting action selection mechanic, which I think works very, very well, in that you can take a number of normal actions, as many as you want, and then you can take a special action, which are obviously much more powerful than your normal actions. But you can't take those special actions again until somebody takes a super special action that clears everything off everybody's boards while also progressing the board state. If that's hopelessly confusing, I apologize. Check out one of the videos that explains the rules more. But that's a good little summary of basically how the action selection mechanic works. And I think that selection mechanic works really quite well. It makes for a relatively easy teach. It makes for a great, easy flow. Turns should go pretty quick in this game with a couple of exceptions. And in a dudes on a map game, low downtime, I think, is at a premium. But there are some clunky bits here. Combat between players is one of them. For combat between two players to be so, I guess, clunky, for lack of a better term, when you have a conflict between two players, you basically flip over a reference card and then you just do a bunch of math, and then you play some cards maybe, and you do some more math, and then you see who has the highest number, and then whoever has the highest number just wins. It's not nearly as clean as something like Risk, where you're just rolling dice. And I know that seems like a strange thing to say, something as clean as just rolling dice, but that's what it feels like. Especially when you're teaching the game to new players, when you explain how player battle works and they look at the back of their card, you can see their eyes glazing over, because it's like, oh, okay, so we get into a fight and then I have to like add up 11 different integers and then that determines if I win or not. It's a bit of a mess. It's also strange for a dudes on a map game to not have casualties as a part of battle. You can have casualties during the battle phase or when you're fighting another player in Lords of Hellas, but usually it's only your own troops that are going to get killed, and that's based on what kind of combat cards you play as part of the combat. You can potentially kill off your opponent's units, but they have to be in a place where they cannot retreat to a neutral or friendly territory. So it doesn't happen very often. And it seems strange to have it be that way, especially when you can pretty easily get all your soldiers out on the board in Lords of Hellas. I would expect a game that lets you put units out as easily as this game does to operate in a way that has you constantly cycling through your troops. It's not the case here. Instead, it's far more often that you get all your troops out on the board and then you just kind of move them around as best you can because they're not dying very quickly. Now, I've said before this game moves briskly and smoothly with a couple of exceptions, and those exceptions are with monster hunting and to an extent with the drafts. I've heard people complain about drafting. When you build temples, you will sometimes trigger a draft where you get to pick from a set of passive cards that go around the table. I've never seen that be that big of a deal. Usually the draft takes 45, 60 seconds, unless there's just a really difficult decision for somebody to make. But overall, I don't think that's that big of an issue, and I think the passive bonuses you get from the drafting are well worth the couple minutes it takes to go through an entire draft. But I do think hunting does bog the game down quite a bit. It's a cool idea, but I don't know how well it works in execution for a couple of reasons. First off, the monsters that you can hunt are huge. They take up an inordinate amount of board space compared to troops and your hero. And the only way to interact with them is to hunt with them, unless they are moving and attacking as part of the end round phase. And then, as far as hunting goes, it's a lengthy process that can take 3, 4, 5 minutes, and that's time where most people are just sitting around the table waiting for the hunt to happen. The rules are not horribly intuitive. Luckily, you've got a little player aid that kind of walks you through the process, and the rule book does a pretty good job of kind of describing what you're supposed to be doing. But it really sucks for the other players when somebody announces a hunt and then everybody just sits around and waits for them to actually get through it. I'm also not quite sure how balanced monster hunting is. Unlike the other win conditions, it's not possible, I don't think, at least as far as I've been able to tell, it's not possible to block somebody from completing the objective once they've already hunted a couple of monsters. And once you get your stats up and you've collected some upgrades, it's frequently pretty easy to go in one shot, especially one of the weaker monsters. And so the only balance I see for monster hunting, the only way to contest others that are doing it is to also do it. And I'm not really a big fan of a strategy like that being only countered by other people also doing that strategy and just trying to do it quicker. At least not in a game like this that professes so many different ways to win. Now, I don't want you to quote me on that because I'm not going to come out and just flat say that monster hunting is not balanced. I haven't seen an extreme number of wins come from it, but it does feel hopeless when you have those games where somebody's just schooling you on monsters and there's really nothing you can do to stop them. And what's additionally frustrating about that is with all the other win conditions, it's very easy to interrupt somebody's plans, with the exception of maybe holding a territory for 3 turns if a monument has been fully built. But getting to that point is so difficult and takes so long that you can pretty clearly see what somebody's doing if they start trying to go down that path, and you can move to counter it really early. Now, I know it sounds like I'm just ragging on the game. I'm not. I like Lords of Hellas quite a bit. It's got tons of replayability, and if you add a couple of expansions, it just goes through the roof. It's the kind of game that begs for an oversized neoprene mat, and I don't know why there isn't one, or maybe there is, I just haven't seen it, but there should be one, kind of like the Scythe of the Rising Sun mats. Because the monsters are so big, they often take up an entire space, and if there's 2 of them in an area, they sometimes way bigger than the space that they're in. So I'd love to see a mat for this. It's a game I'd like to play more often. I'd like to kind of dig my teeth into it a little bit more and see different strategies and the upsets that can come from the game. And so I hope I find it in rotation more often. We'll see if that works. I should note that this is the kind of game that really requires all players to be about the same skill level. If you've got a new player neighboring with an experienced player, that experienced player is probably going to win simply because that new player is not going to know what they need to be doing to block the skilled player from objectives. But other than that, yeah, good game. I love it. It's too big for its box. Folded space. I don't know why you're building a insert for this already. I'm tired of emailing you, telling you to do so. Please get on that. You can keep all the revenue. I don't need credit for anything. Just make an insert so I can buy it, please. Thank you. And that game was called Lords of Hellas. All right, today the feature game is Call to Adventure: The Stormlight Archive, designed by Chris O'Neill and Johnny O'Neill and published by Brotherwise Games. Now, I've talked a little bit about this game before. It was in my recently played games a couple of weeks ago. I've had the opportunity to return to it and play it several times, and now I've got a really strong feel for how the game works. Well, to be fair, really what doesn't work. But before we go on to talk about the Stormlight Archive Edition, I want to talk about the base game itself a little bit. Call to Adventure is an excellent and really near perfect marriage between theme and internal mechanics. To explain what I mean by that, I'm going to summarize the gameplay a little bit. I'm not going to go too deep into the rules, but I'm realizing more and more that I should be giving at least a summary of how a game is played before I start discussing it, so that even if you don't have all the details you'd get from a video where you learn all the rules for a game, you at least have some context for what I'm talking about. So in Call to Adventure, you are a character, essentially. And over the course of the game, you're trying to complete a character arc, for lack of a better way of explaining it. You start with your character's origin and you have a motivation. And these are 2 cards that are face up and they give you some bonuses that will help you complete challenges throughout the game. You also have a third card which acts as your outcome, your finale, the end of your character arc, what your character becomes after all the hardships that you endure over the course of the game. Whereas your first two cards give you some bonuses that help you throughout the game, the third card has a in-game scoring condition of some sort, usually have so many icons of a certain kind. Now, once you've got all that set up, there's a tableau that's laid out that's got a number of challenges on it. And to attempt a challenge, you take a set of runes, which are basically a set of two-sided dice. It's a good way to look at them. And you throw the runes, and if you get enough successes, you complete a challenge. And you put the challenge under your character cards, whether your origin or your motivation, depending on what round that you're in. And those challenges and cards that you collect give you bonuses that give you more runes that you can throw to collect more difficult challenges down the road. You go through 3 rounds. Once a player has completed 3 challenges in the first, second, and third slot of their board, the game ends and you count up points and see who wins. Now, when I said that this game is a near perfect marriage between theme and internal mechanics, what I meant by that was I am constantly impressed when I play this game at how well the symbols that you're trying to collect from challenge cards interact perfectly with the narrative that cards depict. The symbols that are on the cards are all the classic kind of attributes you've seen in role-playing games since the dawn of time. Strength, dexterity, wisdom, intelligence, charisma, blah, 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 all those things. Those are also symbols that appear on your starting cards that kind of give you a little boost, some extra runes you can throw early to collect more symbols, to get more runes, to throw more dice, more runes to collect more symbols. What's remarkable is the way that those symbols that you're looking to grab string together to create a narrative structure that actually feels believable for your character. For example, let's say I'm playing as a character that's got the origin of a pickpocket. It starts me with a couple symbols, probably something like intelligence and agility. What I find fascinating is as cards get flipped up in the tableau for me to attempt challenges for, it's amazing to me how frequently other cards that use my agility and my intelligence traits fit into the narrative of how a pickpocket would grow, at least from a literary perspective. And maybe that's not that impressive from a game design standpoint, but as a person who doesn't have a game design bone in their body, to me, I think that's fascinating. I can't even tell you how many times I've been in the third round of the game, seen cards get flipped up, and thought, wow, my character has this lovely progression from being a humble pickpocket where they were enslaved and then escaped and then aided somebody because they were big-hearted and then were trained as an assassin and then assassinated and killed the big baddie in all the land. It's a fun and impressive way to build a character through a series of depicted experiences. And that, in my opinion, is really what's most fun about this game. The base game is played solely competitively, but what's great about it is that you really, for the most part, don't care about points at the end of the game. Sure, we score them, but what's more fun is ending the game, looking at your tableau, and then telling the story of your character to everybody else at the table. And it's amazing, again, how often those stories make sense just because you were trying to get some symbols to score some points at the end. And I called that internal mechanics because realistically, the mechanics for this game are incredibly simple. It's a very light game, very easy to teach. You're doing a little bit of math, and then you're basically rolling some dice and then adding a card to your tableau. That's the whole of the game. But the way the game functions internally, the internal logic it uses to help push your decisions and to help inform your decisions and build a character that is going to score points, but also create a narrative that makes sense, is really, really impressive. And I'm glad that that aspect of the game is as fun as it is because there are a few problems beneath the hood. For one thing, the balance just is terrible. There are plenty of motivation, origin, and finale cards that are just clearly better than others. For example, there's abilities that just give you little experience tokens, which you can use for a variety of things every time you roll a certain rune, for example. And then there's other starting abilities that say spend 2 of these little experience markers to get to restart or retry a challenge that you failed, which sounds good in context, but these experience crystals are so hard to get and often so important that you just can't be spending them willy-nilly on a failed challenge. There's also an issue with randomness. This is essentially a dice rolling game, which isn't necessarily a bad thing until you consider what the end game conditions are. And that's one of the things that doesn't make sense to me about the game. The end game condition is as soon as a player has achieved 9 objectives, 3 for the first phase, 3 for the second phase, 3 for the third phase, everybody else gets one more turn and then the game ends. That's a big problem in a game that's predicated so much upon luck. Now, yes, you've got some options to mitigate that. If you are collecting certain symbols, you can improve your chances for completing challenges that require those symbols pretty drastically. But it's also very, very easy to just get stuck. We've had plenty of games where a player has been on the third age or the third round, the third set of cards, while a player is just barely getting out of the first one because they just had bad luck in casting their runes. So with the rules the way they stand, it's very, very possible to have one, a runaway leader, and two, to have players that just flat aren't competitive, which is strange and sad for a game that's really as lighthearted as this game kind of is. That randomness also comes into play when you consider you've got a pretty sizable stack of cards for each phase that you're trying to collect challenges for. And you really have very little control over what is available in the tableau for you to pick from, for what challenges you can attempt. You can mitigate this a little bit by spending experience once per turn to get rid of a card you don't want and replacing it with another one. But since you can only do that once per round, and little experience tokens are sometimes really hard to get, you're sometimes just forced to make do with what you have available to you, and that can lead to situations where you have a hard time completing those tasks, those endgame third phase tasks. And so you again have a runaway player issue where whoever was able to just blow through things as easy as pie is going to just trounce everybody at the table because they happen to be luckier when they were throwing their runes. Now, I did say that card randomness is less of an issue at more players. I think that's true. At 3 or 4 players, usually you're cycling through a deck quick enough that you're going to see a wide variety of options, and you're going to usually find stuff you can at least somewhat use. But in 2-player, that is frequently not the case, and in solo, okay, we'll talk about solo in a little bit. Now, there is an expansion to the base game for the Name of the Wind. I suppose it's not directly related to the topic for today, which is the Stormlight Archive version, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit because an issue with the Name of the Wind expansion also comes into play in the Stormlight Archive edition. The Name of the Wind expansion adds some new and potentially interesting elements with the addition of some symbols that give you an option to attempt to learn the name of the wind or of the earth or of the sea. I can't remember. Something like that. It's been a couple weeks. No, it's been a while since I played the Name of the Wind version. Yeah. The problem with these symbols that the Name of the Wind expansion includes is that they are really quite diluted by the cards in the base game. When you integrate that expansion, you do pull some cards out. But even with that being said, it's not uncommon to not hit very many of those special new cards that give you the new mechanic. And even when you do hit them, achieving the little bonus objective that gets added where you can learn the names of the elements is kind of hard to get, even if you've got some bonus cards you can play to help you out a little bit. And so it feels kind of tacked on and doesn't really improve the experience other than giving cards that might represent characters you recognize from the Name of the Wind series. And this leads nicely into kind of what I want to talk about with the Stormlight Archive. A little bit of a disclaimer here as I move into Stormlight Archive. I have read the first 2 books a while ago. It's been a few years, and I've only read them once. So I'm not intimately familiar with the characters, and there's quite a few things depicted in the cards I don't recognize at all. I assume they're probably from the 3rd book, which I haven't read yet. So I give that as context to the fact that I'm not a huge Stormlight Archive fan. For me, playing this version of the game was more about how the game played than recognizing things that I really liked. With that having been said, the first thing I want to say is the theming is on point in the Stormlight Archive version, in terms of symbols and abilities that cards give you fitting within a character's narrative arc. I don't remember everything about the books, but what I did remember fit really, really well into the presentation of each card and in the paths the cards kind of allow you to go down. It's just as good, if not maybe even better, than it was in the base game. It's amazing how often I would see a character that I recognized on a card and then would see a line of cards with that character in it and think, oh wow, this basically is the path this character took throughout the course of the story. And if I wanted to try to get those symbols, I would essentially be doing the same things that they'd be doing. I'd be essentially playing this character, and I think that's very, very impressive. If I was to do that, I wouldn't be playing my own original character. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially for people who are real big fans of the series. Another big bonus to this version is the artwork is gorgeous. I don't normally review components. We're in the golden age of board games where most games have great components. And realistically, there are tons of great games with horrible components and tons of horrible games with great components. So to me, components really don't matter for the most part. I'm going to make an exception in this case, especially because this is a game based upon a novel. So frequently, great illustrations that depict scenes from novels are hard to find. Unless you are a Tolkien or a Rowling, where they're making illustrated versions of your books, getting this much original art based around the story of the Stormlight Archive is phenomenal. And I can't imagine anybody who's a fan of the Stormlight Archive wouldn't just love that aspect of it. To the point where I could see people picking up this game just for getting the artwork and all the cards, just for getting this little guide to Roshar. Roshar, I think, is the name of the land that they live in. Just for getting those little things that breathe some more life into a novel, into something that you've only had depicted in your mind as you've read it. Now, those are both excellent positive points in this version of Call to Adventure's favor, which is good because ultimately, I just don't know if it's very good. A few weeks ago when I spoke about this game, I said that we'd played it once and it seemed like it was really geared towards co-op. When we pulled it out again to play for the second time, I read the rules myself, and come to find out, that's exactly what this version of the game was designed for. It was tailored to be played co-op, which is kind of an interesting idea, except it just doesn't really work co-op. To explain, when one of my groups plays the original Call to Adventure, we play the game competitively in that we're trying to see who scores the most points, sure, but it's not a very cutthroat experience. It certainly could be, I suppose, but generally, if there's a card up that somebody else wants, you kind of let them have it. Because we're more interested in seeing the kind of characters we can create than who can necessarily win by the most points. Now, if there's a card that comes up that I want and Susan wants, then yeah, I'm going to get the card if I can, because I don't care if Susan wants it, I want it too. So I guess the non-confrontational nature is left at the door of, I'll let you have something if I don't want it. I'm not going to spend a diamond to get rid of it just because I know you want it. You know, we're all trying to create our own characters here. And so there's a little bit of tension involved still. And again, I could see people playing it far more cutthroat than we do. Far more similar to a game like a Role Player or something like that. And so I assume the game would translate perfectly well into a co-op version, because that's essentially what we're doing to an extent. But what surprised me is that the game actually turned out to be very, very bland. When there's no, even just that minor sense of tension of we both want a card and we're going to see who gets it first, with even that little bit of tension gone, all of a sudden the game almost felt like a slog. Okay, there's 4 options out. Does anybody want this one? No. Is it okay if I get rid of it? Okay, I'm going to get rid of it. Oh, no, nobody. Do people want this one? This new one? Yeah? Okay. It turned into a game where you aren't really strategically making decisions with your group. You're just flipping over cards, looking at them, and then essentially giving the cards that people want to the players. Of course, they're rolling their runes to see if they can pass the challenge, but again, it just made the game seem really bland. And it doesn't help that the co-op version is really, really, really easy. So you play the co-op version the exact same way you play normal Call to Adventure. The only difference is that you have a boss card, essentially, that sits out on the table, and at the end of the game, everybody will try to complete a challenge against the boss character whose default difficulty is 9. And it can go up based on certain elements of the game. Along with that boss character comes a scenario. There's 4 of them. 3 of them feel like they're very, very much the same. The 4th one is a little more interesting, but I'll talk about that in a second. And those scenarios all say something like, whenever a character gains a certain symbol, make the boss a little bit easier to beat. When a character fails a challenge, make the boss a little bit more difficult to beat. And things, again, 3 of the scenarios, actually all 4 scenarios, basically say that same thing. There's just a twist at the end of the 4th scenario that I haven't talked about yet. And after, I don't know, probably 7, 8 playthroughs, we didn't lose once in the co-op game. In fact, I don't think it even got close in any of our co-op games. It's incredibly easy, which I'm not against having co-op games that are easy, provided that they have ways to kind of ramp up their difficulty. And I guess you could do some house ruling to make this more difficult, but the problem with that is that it doesn't make the co-op experience any more engaging. The 3 rounds that you play through where people are just kind of collecting cards is just a matter of giving people the things that they want while you hope that what you want comes up on the track. It's just the normal call to adventure game with an extra test at the end to see if people maybe win or maybe don't. And to top it all off, it's semi-co-op. The rulebook says that once you're done, you're supposed to count up your points and see who's the most excellent. It's ridiculous. It's the same thing that Legendary does, and I don't know anybody that plays with those rules. Either be co-op or don't be co-op. What is the point of playing the game and winning co-op if you're just going to compare points at the end of the game and say, "Oh no, I'm the real winner"? It's ridiculous. I don't know anyone that likes that kind of mechanic. In retrospect, the end game condition makes a little bit more sense in the co-op version than it does in the competitive version. And by that I mean ending the game when a player hits all 9 challenges. In the competitive version, that rule is ridiculous, and I can't fathom why that was thought to be okay. In the co-op version, it makes a little bit more sense because it stops players from just sandbagging. Oh, I'm at 8 challenges completed and George is only at 6 challenges completed. Well, I'm just going to fail these challenges over and over and over again until he catches up, and then we'll go fight the big bad guy. That doesn't work in the co-op version because every time you fail a challenge, you make the big baddie more dangerous. And you get to the point where you just can't beat him anymore. So it makes more sense here, but it doesn't make the game more interesting. And in a way, it actually kind of aggravates that issue because if I fly through all 3 rounds, nail every challenge and do excellent, and end the game at 9 completed challenges, and George is stuck at 6, odds are he's not going to be able to fight the big bad at the end, and we're just going to lose anyway. So co-op doesn't even really help there, and I don't really understand why they thought that was a good idea. I said I talked about the 4th scenario that was a little more interesting, the 4th co-op scenario, and it functions the same way as the other 3, except for at the very end of the game, in the very last round, any player can choose to align themselves with the big baddie. And if they do that, then the big baddie gets easier to defeat for each person that does it. And at the end of the game, whoever has not aligned themselves with the big baddie attempts their challenge, and if they succeed, then they win, and if they fail, whoever aligned themselves with the big baddie, they win. That's a little bit more interesting than the other scenarios that are basically all the same thing, but only marginally. If this was a 5-player game, maybe that would make more sense. It seems like a strange thing to say that there's a big difference between 4 players and 5 players in that regard, but I think it really would, actually. We played that scenario twice, and one time one player aligned themselves with the big bad, and they lost, because beating the big bad is actually really easy, and he just gets easier as people align themselves with him. And so interesting in concept, but just doesn't work in execution. As a whole, Call to Adventure works much better as a competitive experience, at least in terms of the rules presented in the Stormlight Archive version. And unfortunately, this version of the game just does not play well competitively. And I'd said that before when I talked about it a couple weeks ago. A lot of the cards, a lot of the powers you get, they give you a little bit of a bonus, but give another player a much bigger bonus if you play it on their turn. Or there's abilities that just allow other players to restart challenges that they fail, or to buff up other characters. And so this game doesn't even really work in the competitive variant. You can play it that way, but it's not going to be nearly as satisfying as the base game. And this is coming from somebody who doesn't even play the base game all that competitively. There's rules in the back of the rulebook of the Stormlight Archive version that let you switch out some cards for others, but the issue with that is that you dilute the card pool just as you do with the Name of the Wind expansion, to the point where there's really almost no point in having the Stormlight Archive cards in them. There's a big new symbol that gets included, the Stormlight symbol, and once you dilute the cards available to you with the ones from the base game, you're just not hitting them constantly enough to make playing with the Stormlight inclusion worth it. And the rulebook even warns you against doing that because it's going to affect the balance of each deck and what cards are available to you. So in the end, I really can't recommend the Stormlight Archive version of Call to Adventure to most people. If you're a fan of the series, I think this is a game you're probably going to like, if for no other reason than just the artwork is great, the presentation is great, the internal mechanics, like I said, the way that symbols line up a character's story are really fascinating. But I suspect that most people, even big Stormlight Archive fans, would probably buy this, play it a couple times, and then not play it anymore, just because that co-op version is so samey and really quite half-baked, and the game does not play well competitively. If you're interested in Call to Adventure, absolutely go get the base game. I think the base game's a lot of fun, and maybe even get the Name of the Wind expansion. If you don't get to play with those new extra symbols, that's fine. You still have more options for origins and for motivations and for events that can happen to your character throughout the game. And actually, in that sense, I guess I could understand people wanting to have the Stormlight Archive expansion if they just wanted to add more variety to their game. But they'd have to probably pull out all of the, what are they called? The Night Radiant characters that you can end up as. Because if you mix everything together, you're never going to be able to activate the special powers that the Knights of the Radiant have. And so, yeah, I could see that maybe working. But it'd be a big commitment, and I think you get enough enjoyment out of just the base game. So final verdict is Call to Adventure, enjoyable, light, fun, works best competitively, and honestly can't recommend the Stormlight Archive version unless you're just really interested in the source material and you want the artwork and you'd appreciate having it for its aesthetic sake. And that was Call to Adventure, the Stormlight Archive, designed by Chris O'Neill and Johnny O'Neill and published by Brother Wise Games. Well, that wraps up another week of podcast. Thank you for listening. My name is Ryan Krim. I'm going to remember to introduce myself at the beginning of this podcast someday, but today is not that day. If you'd like to reach me, please email me at learnyourownrules@gmail.com or tweet me at LYORules. I'm still working on getting access to that again, but I will hopefully be able to do so. And realistically, I doubt anyone has listened, much less tweeted me yet, so by the time I get that up, maybe somebody will want to. It is Friday. Go out, play games this weekend, have a great time, and I will see you next week. Game on. Thank you for listening to the Learn Your Own Rules podcast. This podcast is created, produced, directed, and edited by Ryan Krim. Please send help.